Hi, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to our first Schindler Talk of 2025. I want to let everybody know that this conversation is being recorded, and you will be able to see it again if you like it a lot and you want to share it with people on our Schindler House YouTube channel, which I'll put in the chat later. My name is Ann Clark, and I'm a volunteer with the Friends of the Schindler House on the Development Committee. And for those of you joining us for the first time, the Friends of the Schindler House, or FOSH as we call it, manages the maintenance, preservation, and restoration of the Schindler House in West Hollywood, and we are working to raise funds and awareness about this architectural treasure. We're currently working on a comprehensive master plan, which we have raised money to implement, and that will ensure the legacy of this treasure. It's my privilege to organize these Schindler Talks, which were inspired by the salons that Rudolph and Pauline Schindler used to host at their house, the King's Roadhouse in West Hollywood. Pauline Schindler, who was not an architect, but was a very, I guess I'd say, free spirit, her attitude was really to welcome everyone to the home for conversation, music, art, philosophy, politics, and maybe even a little frivolity. We decided that we wanted to continue this tradition by creating an online salon, if you will, and we call it Schindler Talks. It's our intention to welcome everyone to these conversations and grow a community that's inspired by the Schindler House and Rudolph and Pauline Schindler. Tonight's conversation, I would say, is perhaps a bit poignant. While it was originally planned during the latter part of 2024, we didn't really know the greater significance it might have to the Schindler House and to Los Angeles. And since we began planning this conversation, as we all know, LA and particularly Pacific Palisades and Eaton suffered the loss of over 18,000 homes and structures due to the fires. Unfortunately, the Schindler House was not one of the victims of this disaster. We all have a sense of place, a place that means something to us, where we grew up, where we raised our families, where we hold our memories, and how we live in these communities. And it's important as part of our identities. Natural or human disasters usually represent some erasure of this heritage, and the devastation from these fires is almost incomprehensible. But now we have the prospects of rebuilding in front of us. Today, Ioanna Theocharopoulou and Praxiteles Lykos will be in conversation about Ioanna's book, which is about the construction of modern Athens during the mid part of the last century after surviving the devastation of two wars, World War II and the Greek Civil War. As we began this conversation, Ioanna and I, she asked me what this topic had to do with the Schindler House, and frankly, I said, I don't know, it's an interesting topic and maybe not a whole lot, but that's how Pauline and Rudolph would have rolled with it anyway. If they thought you were interesting, they'd invite you to their salon. But as you will see, there may be a little bit more connection to LA and the Schindlers than we thought. And in my 4 years of volunteering with Friends of the Schindler House, I found it to be a constant inspiration. I expect we might learn something about resilience and moving forward to rebuild a place that is dear to many, which is definitely in the spirit of the Schindlers and the Schindler House. So just before we get started with the conversation, a few housekeeping rules. I'm going to introduce Praxiteles, and he will introduce Ioanna more, and then they will be in conversation because they are the experts on this topic. And please, if you have questions, enter them into the chat, and I'll be monitoring those. And if it makes sense to interject during the conversation, I will. They'll talk for 30 to 40 minutes. And then it will be a kind of fluid conversation, and you'll answer questions, and please send your comments as well. And we'll wrap up as we see fit. So at this time, I want to introduce Praxiteles, who is an architectural designer with 10 years of experience designing and building projects at a variety of scales. He's a project designer at Bernheimer Architecture in New York City, where he works primarily on affordable and market rate housing in the New York City area. He's got extensive experience with the design of complex design mixed-use developments, as well as high-end residential projects. in addition to some freelance design collaborations, he also teaches part-time at the Parsons School of Design, and he holds a degree in as a Bachelor of Architecture from the Rhode Island School of Design. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Praxiteles.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I really appreciate it. And also thank you for the invitation. It was a really nice surprise and a great pleasure to be here. As you said, I'm Praxiteles Lykos. I'm a project designer at Bernheimer Architecture. And my work focuses on housing, which is something that we're going to discuss at length in a very different context. So Ioanna and I are going to walk you through various aspects of her work, and some of the ideas for discussion are going to cross, I think, all facets of housing and domesticity. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Ioanna. Ioanna Theocharopoulou is an architect and architectural historian whose research focuses on cities and on how the socio-material infrastructures that architects project contribute to long-term transformations of the atmosphere, biotic habitats, and oceans. Most recently, her teaching has focused on how architecture and its histories can offer insights for responding to the climate crisis. Her writing has appeared in numerous books and journals, and she's participated in and collaborated on curating and chairing several academic conferences. She's the author of the book that we're here to discuss, Builders, Housewives, and the Construction of Modern Athens, published in 2017. Her book formed the basis of an eponymous award-winning documentary film by Tassos Langis and Yannis Gaitanidis. She teaches Art Humanities at Columbia University. So I'm going to take you through, before we get to Ioanna's main presentation, some kind of core ideas about Athens and the kind of conceit of our discussion today. Why are we having this discussion? The Schindler House was kind enough to invite us to discuss Ioanna's work, both her book and the documentary, which is about to come on YouTube in a couple of days. When Ioanna and I sat down to discuss the themes of this presentation, we had a long coffee, and one of the main things we touched on was this idea of expectations about cities, and specifically Athens. What would the audience think about Athens? What ideas do they come to the table with about a city that's lived in the collective imagination of Western culture for so long? What are our own preconceived notions about a city that we've experienced? And what does the audience already know about modern Greece? We decided to use this initial device, which is a simple comparison between Athens and LA, to draw out some of the main points of discussion. Much of this audience is probably familiar with ideas about home. The American consumer culture, in particular, has widely packaged and marketed ideas about domesticity. We in the States are familiar with images of idealized suburban life, and our families were promised some of the same ideals of suburban convenience that in Southeastern Europe at the same time, post-World War II, Greek families in very different contexts experienced a transition from rural to urban life with many similar images of modernity, but very different ownership models for those building forms. These different ideals about what constitutes an ideal home and how your average person would obtain that home define in very particular ways how our cities look and feel. So to begin with some commonalities, we have two images on the screen here. Both are looking at the metro areas of LA, Greater LA County, and of Athens, which sits in Southeastern Europe and in the Attic Peninsula. And despite the kind of equivalency in the image size, we're talking about very different scales of city. So LA County has nearly 10 million people, and the Greater LA metro region has almost 18.3 million people. The center of Athens has about 600,000 people with a greater metro area of 3.6 million. So very different in kind of scale, but looking at the satellite image morphologically, they share tons of similarities. So they're both cities that deal with extensive urban sprawl, but they are situated in mountain valleys. They are settled plains. And you can see on the next slide, sorry, I mean, we can continue talking using the satellite images, but you can look at you can look at the urban form of Athens as compared to LA and see these consistent commonalities in overall urban character. I think that if you shift to the next slide, Ioanna.
Sorry, Praxiteles. Can you
Okay,
hear?
no problem. Sorry, we're
Is this
coordinating.
the slide we wanted?
Just the next one.
Oops, this one.
We're still seeing the first slide of the satellite images. We're moving to the next slide.
Okay. I'm going to stop sharing because it's looking like it's moving along in mine, but it's not moving. What do you see now?
We have I think it's the third or fourth slide. Yes, perfect. There we go. Perfect.
So here's the first slide. This is the
There we
second
go.
slide.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm so sorry about
everyone
that.
for the kind of coordination. So this is an image that looks at the urban form of Athens as compared to kind of its surrounding area. So Athens is extremely dense. It's again situated in a valley, just like LA is. But you have this kind of gradation to agricultural area outside of the built up kind of dense urban core. Next slide. So again, looking at commonalities between Athens and LA, I was struck by the fact that both LA and Athens have significant and canalized river systems, both the LA River, which is an iconic image of Los Angeles, and the River Kifissos, which is a large river that passes through the center of Athens. Both of these, due to the equivalent post-war urban development that happened, both of these conditions have kind of concretized and canalized natural systems in these cities. Go to the next slide. Yeah, you can see this image of the Acropolis, which defines, really the icon of Athens in the popular imagination. And you can see the extent to which kind of the natural environment was less built up. And Ioanna will talk at length about the kind of history of this, but it's important to remember as you go into this conversation that Athens was a very small settlement up until very, very recently. Even though it's an ancient city, it's a city that's very contemporary in its total form. Next slide. So we can see the kind of nature of this sprawl, which is constituted for the most part by the polykatoikia, which is this eponymous 5 to 8 story apartment block that defines Athenian urban form. And this is a nice image of it, which pictures the Acropolis. You see the Bay of Phaleron in the distance. But again, the kind of universal aspect of this urban form. Next slide. So another point of commonality is the car. Like much of the USA, in LA, a car is essential. It's essential for transportation, and despite the presence of a public transport network, road traffic is a defining aspect of the LA experience. Greeks too, they love cars. It's something that, sets, and again, talking about expectations, it's something that sets Greece a little bit apart about what you would expect of the rest of Western Europe in terms of infrastructure. Athens is an extremely dense and walkable city with a modern metro network that was updated during the 2004 Olympic Games, which is another commonality, by the way. Both cities have hosted the Olympics twice. Athens, the very first modern Olympics in the late 1800s, and also the 2004 Olympic Games. And LA has hosted in 1932, 1984, and is going to host them again. So we're dealing with contexts that are kind of highly urbanized. They have tons of kind of car-based infrastructure. Athens is a little distinct because it's a more dense urban fabric fundamentally. Next slide. Yeah, again, we're talking about cities that have hosted the Olympics, and that's influenced their infrastructural development, particularly in their most contemporary incarnations. Next. So this is another view of kind of anonymizing the Athenian sprawl. This is something that cuts out the image of the Acropolis, and you're looking purely at the kind of sea of the polykatoikia. Next. So this is a view of kind of typical Los Angeles sprawl. So it's a more spread out, density. You've got almost entirely single family housing that's constituting the main unit of the city. And you have, again, this focus on car infrastructure. Next. So when we zoom in a little bit to the street level aspect of of Athenian urban form. You know, I think anyone that's visited Athens and has spent time in the center, you'll see the kind of within the ubiquity of the polykatoikia and the kind of endless blocks and balconies, there's a kind of chaos to it. But for me, it was extremely comforting when I was a kid, and I found it really exciting and liberating when I would visit as a young adult. This is a really wonderful painting by Yannis Tsaroukis, who's a very well-known Greek painter, depicting a cafe at night in Athens. This was painted, you know, in the mid-60s, so it's roughly the period that we're talking about, and that Ioanna will be spending her time discussing. But I want to share it not only because it's a beautiful painting, but I think it sort of captures the armature in which, you know, human and Athenian life is being expressed. You know, the social life in Athens both revolves both historically and presently through innumerable bars, cafes, small gardens, churches, all of these things that inhabit this kind of apartment block framework. If you go to the next slide. This is an extremely typical view of a night in Athens. It's taken from a city that's in the center. You see a lot of characteristics that make up what makes this urban form really wonderful. You have this kind of really beautiful blending of what's public, what's private. You have the internal space spilling out into the street. You have enormous layers of pedestrian. There's a little bit of graffiti. You know, life is lived semi-publicly in Athens, and its urban form offers this kind of remarkable framework in which people can find space for expression. So Ioanna is going to talk now about how all of this has come to be. So Ioanna, please take it from here.
Okay. Thank you very much. Can you see my slide? Yeah, right.
Yes.
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much, Anne and Friends of the Schindler House, for this really delightful invitation to talk about my work, and thank Praxiteles for being such a wonderful collaborator and interlocutor tonight. It's been a pleasure to meet you, and I look forward to many more conversations. So tonight I'm going to talk about a reading of post-war Athens, what I call social infrastructures and imaginaries, and I will explain that term. And what I will talk about is based on my book, as Praxiteles mentioned. It's called Builders, Housewives, and the Construction of Modern Athens. It was first published in 2017 in London, and then republished and sort of edited produced by the Onassis Foundation in Athens, with generous support from the Onassis Foundation in 2022. And there's a wonderful introduction by forward by Kenneth Frampton. So we're talking about Athens. We already saw some images from Praxiteles. So I would say that to this day, Athens is considered by many as an ugly city. A city of cement, and a disappointment to historians as well as to its citizens. Evidence of this disappointment, if not letdown or discontent, has been everywhere, both in popular culture and in the academic press throughout its modern history. Clearly, the reality of this relatively young city has consistently elicited unfavorable comparisons, for one thing, to the majesty of its classical past. And here is a popular culture image, a cartoon from the 1960s of the modern city about to devour the Parthenon. The white Northern European fantasy of a pure and white ancient Greece, and Athens as the cradle of Western civilization, still rarely fail to elicit unfavorable comparisons between the contemporary city and the majesty of its classical ruins. In my work, I try to unravel the source of this comparison and offer an alternative reading of Athens using the concept of social infrastructures and imaginaries. So in my talk tonight, I will be asking who were those who built the city, what was the story of their encounter with the project of modernity, and by social infrastructures and imaginaries, I mean, I mean a way to interact. I mean, sort of trying to find a way to interact with the histories of those who built the city, whom I call builders and housewives, and who have been mostly frowned upon by architects and historians of the era and since, and not talked about. So for a start, there is the fraught relationship between Greece and Europe. And as Praxiteles mentioned, we need to remember that Greece is actually a fairly young country. It gained its independence from the Ottoman Empire during the 1820s, and it became a state, an independent state, in 1834. It's interesting that in its fight for independence, it was supported by the great European powers. But in the signing of the independence, Greece was not present at the signing of the treaty that confirmed its statehood. And that was signed between the new Bavarian prince, who became our king, and the other great powers. But that's another story, which I cannot delve into tonight. But I do want to mention a couple of things. The first is that the teenaged king, the Prince Otto von Wittelsbach, was the son of Leopold, King Leopold of Bavaria. And we see here an image of the architects of the king who actually accompanied his son, Prince Otto, to Athens. So he arrived, Prince Otto arrived first in Nafplion, then in Athens in 1832, bringing with him a large cohort of artists, architects, archaeologists, lawyers, and other Bavarian intellectuals to help him rule this newly liberated land. One of the first things they did was to cleanse, first of all, the first is to create a plan for Athens. This is the first urban plan, 1833, before the foundation of the state in 1834, by Stamatis Kleanthis and Edward Schaubert, which sort of made a much, very European, sort of had a very European vision, with large boulevards and squares and gardens. This was not followed. It was then again, there was a new plan by Leo von Klenze, who also made this painting here, a sort of imaginary modern Greece, sort of among the ruins of the past. And this is another one of his paintings. So he was a very important figure in the court of Otto. And of course, he was a very important architect in his own right, and designed the Valhalla as an absolute copy of the Parthenon in Germany. So there is this strange relationship between how the Europeans saw their own modernity in Greece, yet Greece at that time was just becoming just gaining its independence. So it was impoverished. It was, it was very needy. And so there was this way in which the Europeans saw their modernity in a way, as Michael Herzfeld, the anthropologist Michael Herzfeld, has written, there was a kind of crypto-colonialism here. And that term for him means a form of independence that was actually dictated by the Western European powers without explicitly colonizing. But it's almost like they colonized the imagination. So one aspect, a defining kind of aspect of this in architecture, or rather a concrete example of this in architecture, here we see Friedrich Schinkel's visionary suggestion for the proposal for the king's new palace on the Acropolis, right among the Parthenon. But a concrete example of this sort of colonization of the imagination is the introduction of neoclassicism to Greece, which was a European, Prussian, Bavarian interpretation of classical culture. And of course, there were a lot of new excavations going on at that moment. So the European, the sort of Bavarian architects were very much looking at the excavations and archaeological evidence and trying to use it in these neoclassical buildings, they made the first public buildings, such as these ones, which are the university, the National Library, and the Academy. It was their interpretation, but it didn't have that much to do with the city that existed there at that time. This process was very complex, but for tonight, I just wanted to show you this example. And an image from Athens at the beginning of the 20th century, showing the scale of the city center and the extent of the local version of neoclassicism. So first there were the public buildings, and then there were the sort of local residential neoclassical buildings that started to populate Athens as it grew and expanded. And here we see a beautiful image of Omonia Square in the early 20th century, one of the main squares in Athens, with the palm trees that were actually cut down. The story goes that they were cut down because they were too Eastern. And Eastern for Greece at that moment meant too much still connected to the Ottomans and the Turkish people, and not Greek enough. So they were cut down. So there were all these conflicts over identity that, for me, played out in the architecture. Here we see women walking in a central Athens street from 1915, and neoclassical houses on either side of the street, and a wide tree-lined boulevard. So a great defining event in Greek history is what we call in Greece the Asia Minor disaster, which was our failed war with Turkey, 1922-1923, which one of the results was a massive influx of exchanged populations, i.e. We sent majority Muslim populations to Turkey, and Turkey sent all sort of ethnic Greeks from Asia Minor who had, lived there for centuries to Greece, and they suddenly arrived and they had nothing, and there was a huge crisis how to house them. They were at first camping out near the temples. There were also Armenians, because they had also been persecuted by the Young Turks at that moment. So this is an image of young orphans, both Greek and Armenian refugees, taken care by the American Near East Relief. So the Greek state had to, for the first time, create social housing, and this is the first social housing that was produced actually for refugees by these excellent architects, Kimon Laskaris and Dimitris Kyriakis. 1934. And 1934 is important because that's the year of the introduction of modern architecture to Greece, with the formal introduction, with the SIAM meeting, the Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, the SIAM conference number 4 that took place aboard the ship Patris II that cruised from Athens to the Aegean Islands and back. At that point, modern architecture was widely accepted. In fact, Le Corbusier famously scratched his compliments on the wall of a brand new school building by Kyriakos Panagiotakos on Lyceum Street. So these are the first polykatoikia buildings. So as I said, as a result of the refugee crisis, there are two things. First, there's social housing, not very much, just a few buildings of social housing that still exist today. And the second was a mandated densification. So for that, there was a new law that mandated that you could now have what's called horizontal ownership. And that was very critical in the design of the polykatoikia, and that term polykatoikia, which you see here on your screen, means multi-level apartment block. So that's a sort of generic term of any apartment block. But the specific form it takes in Athens is a small scale, 6 to 8 floors maximum apartment building that the majority of which was built during this period. and it's still there today. So it makes the city as we see it, it's the majority of the buildings that we see when we look at the city, even to this day. So now I want to talk about the builders and the new financial system of Antiparochi, most responsible for the speed and effectiveness of the urban expansion of the polykatoikia was the financial system of Antiparochi. Antiparochi means part exchange. That's how it's usually translated. It doesn't have a precise translation because the process does not exist in the same way anywhere else. What it means is this kind of bottom-up social as well as financial transactional process whereby a single or double family neoclassical house or larger, and here you see a very, very modest house on the left, which was probably a refugee house, and on the right, a single family, neoclassical looking home. And to the left side of the image, you see the polykatoikia, the brand new sort of sparkling white building that has 6 floors. And so you see the contrast between the two. And so what would happen is that the developers, what this process was about, the developers would buy the land on which the building stood, and they would demolish the building, the existing building, and instead build this new apartment block. So as a kind of bottom-up financial transactional process, these single or double family neoclassical houses were exchanged, or existing 19th century or early 20th century buildings were exchanged or given over to developers without cash changing hands, with the promise that the owners would get in return 2 or 3 apartments in the new polykatoikia building. So the developers, in essence, bought the land. They would duly demolish the houses and turn them into polykatoikia. They would keep the majority of the apartments and sell the rest so as to finance their next project. With this system, everyone was happy. The owners of the old houses that desperately needed updates, such as installing heating or plumbing and other such repairs, became owners of apartments that came with all of those modern conveniences. They could live in one of them and then rent the others for income or give them to their daughters as a dowry. The developers essentially only needed their tools and enough money for building materials to start work. They would go around neighborhoods to look for neoclassical buildings that looked as though they were in a bad state, and would approach the owners and ask whether they wanted to do this process of Antiparochi. They would then negotiate and start work. The process was incredibly efficient, to the point that it was parodied in popular culture, in films, and I talk about this in my book and explore it in more depth. But I wanted to say here just quickly that the success of the Antiparochi meant or had as a kind of outcome the almost complete erasure of the 19th century city. And here we see photographs of buildings that no longer exist, taken by Stelios Kopelitis. But we can see that they were falling apart. A lot of them were really falling apart. And it would have been, prohibitively expensive for their owners to update them. So this system gave everyone a way to both have a place to live and potentially another apartment for the other members of their family, or for rental income. This is an interior photograph of urban life in pre-war, pre-World War II, what I think as a neoclassical house interior, a woman lighting a fire on a small tin tray a few inches above the floor to keep warm, because there was no central heating at that moment in these houses. So So how did the system persist? Well, for one thing, mortgage was not developed well in Greece until the mid-1960s. And secondly, a key figure here during the 1940s and the early post-war reconstruction period was Konstantinos Doxiadis, the brilliant architect and administrator who later became one of the post-war era's most prolific international planners. He was important because as a high-ranking government official during the war and early post-war period, he recognized the inability of the Greek government to fund housing. So he chose to direct all available resources, particularly the aid coming from the US Marshall Plan, to public infrastructural works, such as roads, ports, airports, bridges that had completely been destroyed by the Germans during the occupation and later by the Civil War. Or they were severely damaged during the entire decade of the 40s, which was a decade of war, more or less. So he tacitly encouraged the dissemination of the Antiparochi, even though he never sort of spelled this out. It's clear from all the research, not just my research, but lots of other researchers who have looked at the source of the Antiparochi. No one has found one specific place where the Antiparochi as a process starts. It's really a bottom-up phenomenon that starts gradually and is, in a way, as I said, tacitly encouraged by the Greek government at that time. As a system or as an economic act, in my view, it was not unlike bartering or gift exchange. It was a basic organizing mechanism and exchange among people throughout the world where the outcome is mutual benefit. It relied on oral negotiation and was rooted in earlier oral culture, characterized by immediacy of communication and informal exchange of rural Greece. So who were these builders? Well, they were, in short, internal migrants who started coming from the Greek countryside, which had been devastated by a whole decade of war. In the post-war period, the early post-war period, the village, literally came to the city. There was a reversal of proportions of rural and urban between 1951 to 1971. From 38% and 48% respectively to 53 and 35. The builders were primarily men who looked to create a better life for themselves and their families. Often they had come from the left politically, so they could not find other work, but they could work in construction. There were no large corporations. The builders were organized in small teams, going from neighborhood to neighborhood, looking for work. They were never more than loosely composed of varying specialties, such as marble workers, concrete workers, plasterers, terrazzo makers, floor workers, etc. It was generally true that until the post-war period, specific regions produced construction crews who were good at particular building tasks, such as Epirots, who were known for masonry building, Cycladic men for marble. There was a horizontal hierarchy between them rather than an employer versus employee organization. They helped each other, especially because building teams were made of extended family members very often, but mostly were made from people who came from the very same village. And so they trusted each other. There was a lot. So the polykatoikia. Actually, before I go to that, I want to show you some images of the destruction of the neoclassical houses. And I gained a lot of the material from this from watching old black and white films and looking at magazines and newspapers, cartoons such as this one, which shows a bulldozer threatening a 19th century neoclassical house soon to become a polykatoikia. This is an image of the builders. And here they are. One important point is that these were craft or quasi-vernacular processes that they used. There was no standardization. They relied on communal work in small teams. And aside from concrete, there were no other major industries for building materials at that time in Greece. And here is a typical polykatoikia. This is from 1952. It was always 6 to 8 floors, 8 stories high. There was a mandate that buildings in Athens, especially at the center, could never be taller or higher than the Acropolis. They could not block the view of the Acropolis. So that was partly why all these buildings remained relatively small scale. They were white, they had undecorated facades, balconies, flat roofs, large windows. Here we have an image of the new polykatoikia next to an old single-story neoclassical home that would be soon demolished or exchanged through the Antiparochi. So there were quite quasi-vernacular processes. Another point that's really important, you can actually see here on the left of the polykatoikia on the lower left, that the ground floor of the polykatoikia mostly or almost always contained stores or commercial uses. So there were vegetable stores and meat stores, clothing, small plumbing and appliances, electricians, as well as professional offices such as doctors, lawyers, all typically accommodated on the ground floors, establishing what today we might call a mixed-use city, where everything you need was always within walking distance. And this relates back to the last image that we saw from Praxiteles' slides, created, in fact, the way in which the ground floors were primarily public or semi-public. To this day, it's as if the residential city rests above a vast and fluid semi-public space. There's also the other point that's interesting is that the more affluent people lived on the top floors, and the less affluent families lived, on the ground, closer to the ground. And this sort of horizontal hierarchy made for a much more mixed urban fabric, because of course there were a few neighborhoods that were, very much a sort of upper middle class, but mostly there was a very easy kind of mix. Everyone lived in a polykatoikia. Those who could afford it would purchase the higher apartments, the others lower. And here's another image, a rendering of a polykatoikia from the early 70s. So the polykatoikia apartments offered a much higher standard of living, especially for women who spent more of their time in the interior, because all of them, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about that, the domesticity in the interior, had infrastructure that was really new for the time. This is a really interesting ad for a lottery. Whoever won this lottery, they would win an apartment in a polykatoikia. And the diagram is made as a section of a polykatoikia, where the least, starting from the smallest and least significant appliance on the ground floor, the mixer, and it's moving up through the floors to an electric vacuum cleaner, refrigerator, an ironer, dishwasher, washing machine, electric stove, finally an air conditioner, which for sure was mostly a dream in Athens in 1961. So this is advertising all these new appliances and, facilities for the housewife and for the family. Here's another advertisement for another lottery. This is a book, a kind of household manual called the Contemporary Housekeeping. So the polykatoikia offered the higher standard of living, especially for women. There was electricity, there was central heating, there were bathrooms inside the apartment, running water, new appliances. And there are all these fun advertisements. This one says the advantages of a good vacuum cleaner, which the way that it's staged, it almost looks like there's the advantages of a good housewife. That's how I've always perceived it. This is a modern woman and a modern woman and a delicious kitchen, delicious, dinner and modern home, something like that. There's this connection between women and domestic objects, and that's not just in Greece, but there's a lot of this press and media that is super interesting that I looked at when I was doing my research. And I don't have time to go through all of them, but I want to keep this not too long. But so was this modern architecture? For me, there's a relationship to modern architecture, especially in the use of reinforced concrete as a material, which was basic to all polykatoikia construction. But I believe that the process was more complex than a simple one-way copy of the Corbusian domino, despite the apparent similarities to modern architecture, such as the unornamented white facades, the roofs, the flat roofs, the horizontal lines, modern materials. The polykatoikia is also unlike modern architecture in some important ways. It is a kind of simplified version of modern architecture that lacked the latter's political and aesthetic agenda. In addition, it was received and interpreted without the fundamental project of a radical break that modern architecture depended on. At the same time, this version of modern architecture, too, involved a process of interpretation and imagination. It was formed collectively, it produced something new, and represented something important about the context from which it grew, no matter how aesthetically displeasing it might still be to us. Looking at it this way, this urbanism enriches our understanding of cities as a collective design activity by different groups: builders, developers, architects, engineers, planners, bureaucrats, and yes, housewives. All of these groups had their own design sensibilities that came into play. The transposition between the rural world to the city that they represented also enhances our understanding of the movement between high and low, or elite formal architecture and informal structures. The polykatoikia did not arrive as a finished product from somewhere else, like, say, cinema. It was about adapting and adjusting to the needs of the community. Lastly, I have a few thoughts on the relationship between innovation and stereotyping. Although supposedly monstrously homogeneous, the post-war polykatoikia in Athens always had small variations, as if using certain stock parts that came from the same simplified elements of modern architecture. It seems a series of more or less given or fixed components, such as the reinforced concrete frame, the facades that are always white, balconies, flat roofs, marble-clad lobbies, etc., with small adjustments and modifications. The city grew in a way, in a kind of a cumulative way, rather than in a sort of top-down planned way. In the sense of repetition, redundancy, formal simplification, dependency on oral negotiation, gift exchange, negotiability, all of these elements in my reading, it's as if in the post-war polykatoikia was a kind of built-in equivalent of a vernacular oral process. So if modern architecture was about the notion of type, the way that I read it, the polykatoikia was about a stereotype. It lacked originality and individuality. It used things for purposes other than they were originally intended, in ways that had popular appeal. But stereotypes can be enabling and not just necessarily forms of entrapment and victimization, as the critic Ray Chow reminds us. The post-war polykatoikia development was enabling in that it enabled the transformation of rural migrants into urban dwellers with urban aspirations and a modern way of life. It therefore contributed to the modernization of Greek society. Like the American suburban house, the polykatoikia was also successful at the level of popular symbolism, representing and expanding access to the good life, as well as progress and optimism, especially for young women who had a much more comfortable everyday life in their interiors. The polykatoikia's main success was that through its unique process of production, it became a vehicle for post-war society to make itself anew. It allowed for possibilities of renewal within the web of everyday life, and thus offers us an example of architecture's transformative power. Without losing its class base, it crossed social layers, canceling strict dichotomies. The polykatoikia embodied the negotiability of Greek society at that point in time, where some things can be easily turned around, yet others stubbornly remain the same. Thank you. So we thought we would end the conversation with some sort of reflection on climate change, right? Praxiteles, would you like to?
So thank you for the bulk of the presentation. It's an incredible body of work and I think extremely interesting. We wanted to touch on this idea of the impact of climate change on Athens today, right? Because this is an urban condition that is one of the most vulnerable to climate change in Europe. It's a capital city that routinely experiences horrific wildfires in kind of the broader area, and the country generally, unfortunately, is threatened by that, and it's something that's going to continue to get worse, as time goes on and as climate change advances. I think that when we were talking about, what we would discuss and how we would discuss it for this presentation, there's this idea that, we didn't want to introduce the polykatoikia as a kind of didactic thing that needs to be necessarily mimicked as an ideal form, but it's more recognizing that a kind of density, a kind of mixed use urban settlement has these aspects that are extremely successful if you look at them closely. And, unfortunately, they do have to exist within this broader climate framework, but the areas in which they are successful on a human level, I think are extremely relevant. There are additional questions that we have, and we can have a discussion, I think, about this idea of housing affordability, of all these broader issues that many major capital cities face. It's not only an issue in Athens. Certainly in New York, where I predominantly practice, the access to housing and the ability to afford your home is something that presents a huge challenge to young people today. And one of the things that's always struck me about like the Athenian context is that, you're confronting a city that is, number one, depending on an enormous influx of tourism, which affects services, it affects the nature of certain investments. The prevalence of things like Airbnb have a huge impact on housing in downtown, in the center of Athens. It affects broader ideas about affordability. And we also have broader programs like the Golden Visa program that heavily incentivize wealthy investment in, from abroad in the Athenian urban environment. And it makes it very difficult for your average working, Athenian family to be able to advance on this ladder of kind of home ownership. So it's one of the interesting conditions because Greece, like historically speaking, has had extremely high levels of home ownership because of this Antiparochi system, which existed outside of, how we typically understand the financing and the development of buildings. It's something that is very different from how development happens in New York or in Los Angeles. And it produced a really, really high level of home ownership up until the financial crisis. Introduction and the proliferation of mortgages and other kind of lending models contributed very heavily to the impact that the financial crisis had on your average you know, your average Greek person. And these issues persist, and they're in parallel, I think, and simultaneous with the challenges faced by climate change, because they affect where the state puts money, they affect the types of infrastructure that are invested in, and it's a broader and really entangled net. Yeah, I mean, so I think maybe this is the point where we shift into either discussion amongst ourselves, or we take
I
questions
do
from
have
the
a
audience.
couple
What
of
do you think,
questions,
Dan?
and if I can throw these out there. Got 1830s plan of the city showed a dense medieval quarter of the Acropolis. Presumably ancient temple ruins were subsumed in city fabric, a la Diocletian's palace, and split. The early 20th century photo shows Acropolis with ruins only, the medieval urban fabric completely removed. When did this happen? Who was responsible and why? And how and why, sorry, this is part 2, did the Plaka neighborhood avoid being replaced with polykatoikia? I didn't say this right.
I mean, that's a really comprehensive and great question.
Yes.
Good luck.
Thank you for this question. I tried to say in the beginning how, but I didn't have time to go into it too much, but the idealization of ancient Greece kind of worked to the detriment of all the other sort of layers and historical and memories from other eras. You know, since classical times. So when the Bavarian prince arrived in Athens in 18, and the state was founded in 1834, they decided to cleanse the city of really anything that was not classical, any sort of ruins that were not classical. So there was a Frankish tower in the in the Acropolis right until the early 19th century that we can see in old photographs. That was dismantled. Earlier, there was, of course, an Ottoman minaret, and that was dismantled. You know, and the excavations began, and they're still ongoing. I mean, and the restoration of the Parthenon is still ongoing. So it's a you know, it's a kind of fraught story. It's a difficult story. What do you preserve and why? And I think there's always been this tension in modern Greece.
Yeah.
I'm sure that this answers the first part of the question. What do you think, Praxiteles?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the thing that I've always been struck by whenever this issue comes up, like Greece is like every other kind of nation that came about in the mid 1800s. They're working with ideas about nationalism and what constitutes the kind of national myth. Greece is, I think, an interesting case in that so much of our historical imagery and so much of our iconography has lived in the kind of broader imagination of the West and of itself, that processes of constructed identity, you know, tend to favor the classical period. They tend to favor things over other time periods. You know, I mean, it's a city that's been continuously inhabited for 3,000 years, nearly 1,000 of which were you know, in the Byzantine period, which is the Eastern Roman period. You know, and then this is followed by 400 years of an Ottoman period. So there's an enormous length of time that, you know, is built up, and there are at various points and for various reasons decisions made about what's to be preserved and what's to be shown and what's to be recorded. I think the question was asking about the second part of it was asking about Plaka specifically. And Plaka is for those in the audience that don't know, it's a small neighborhood that's right on the slopes of the Acropolis itself, and it constituted much of the historic fabric. And I think, and I don't know specifically why it was as preserved as it was, but it did have much of this character of being sort of much more informal. It wasn't nearly as nice as it is now, and it's kind of preserved and kind of, I think, I don't know how you would express it, but like it's very, very kind of tourist oriented and frozen in time. And I think some of Ioanna's images of the kind of decrepitude of the neoclassical buildings at the time are indicative of that. I mean, you had very rough constructions, and I think it was a product of just like they were building out further out in the city, and they kept it as it was because it was well inhabited by informal individuals. Do you agree with that, or?
Yes, I want to add that, you're right. I mean, the slopes of the Acropolis, it's a really interesting place. They're called anaphiotica. They're actually where the builders of the modern city lived. And so they look like a Cycladic village. And Plaka is there and also right below. And I think the reason that it was kept, I mean, on top of what you said, Praxiteles, is that during the early 70s, I think it's around 73 or 74, there finally preservation laws that come into effect. So the state actually recognizes. I mean, it's towards the end of the junta period. There's a lot of rethinking and reorganizing, and so the fact that the neoclassical fabric was completely, becoming completely eradicated, finally came to the conscience of the public, and so that they stopped. And so they kept Plaka as a historic center. But most of the neoclassical city was lost, even though there are, if you walk around Athens, there's still lots of little very humble buildings that have neoclassical elements that are really fascinating, I think.
More questions.
It's still there. It's not completely lost.
Ian's asking, how did population in Athens change during the 20th century?
I mean, it grew immensely after 1923. And at the moment, the population, Praxiteles, you said it's around 1.3 million?
Greater.
Athens, like the broader metro area, has I think 3.6 million, which is nearly, I think it's roughly a third of the entire population of Greece.
Yes,
And
yes,
we
so
talk about
huge.
the like Athenization of Greece because it contains so much of the settlement. Like Athens center, which is the delineation around kind of that triangle and the various monuments, that has a population of about 600,000 people. But in essence, it's one contiguous kind of urban mass of about 3.6 million people.
How much destruction was there during the Greek Civil War, and what years did that occur?
The years are between 1946 and 1949. The destruction was enormous. Remember, it followed almost immediately after the end of the German occupation, the Second World War, which Athens, particularly Athens, suffered a great deal because the Germans sort of cut off all the supplies and people were starving and just dying on the streets. There were corpses, everywhere. And it was a really, really difficult time. So after that, there was, there were a series of incidents which then became a civil war in 1946, and it ended in 1949. So the whole decade of the 40s, from 1941, when the Nazi occupation begins, to the last penultimate year of the 1940s, is a whole decade of war and destruction. And the damage that was done in rural areas was enormous. And because the Civil War, fought between the sort of communist left and the right, which were supported, the West, I mean, Greece was one of the bulwark states against communism in the Cold War. So there was a lot at stake. So living in a small rural community or a village, you could not really live if you were from, there was a lot of killing going on. You couldn't hide if you had different political views. So going to a city, a big city, you could actually kind of, find a new life, which you couldn't have in the village. So there was a massive internal migration for that reason. as a consequence of all the war and destruction and political dichasmos. How do you say? Yeah, political difference. Yeah.
I got another one here. I would appreciate reference of the polykatoikia to the urban fabric of Athens, specifically in terms of zoning ordinances, infrastructure, landscaping, or lack of it.
Right. So these are terms that don't always apply to Greece, to Athens. I mean, zoning. That's something that, it's interesting because in 1934, the conference, the SIAM conference, the what is it called? The Athens Charter is about zoning. It's about these different like residential and business and recreation, the four areas that the modern architects kind of define. But that was never really followed in Athens. That was never, there were attempts at top-down planning, but they were never really very successful. They would get to a point and then they would sort of fall apart. So yes, there is a grid that actually quite closely follows the early 19th century plans, kind of like the one I showed, but a newer version of it, which has the Acropolis and the Syntagma Square and Ammonia Square. There's this sort of triangle. And that is still kept. You can still read that when you look at Athens from above. But unfortunately, the parks, I mean, aside from the really lovely national park that's right behind the Parliament building, or adjacent to the Parliament building, that was initially the King's Park, Royal Park. Aside from that, there are small parks, but there's not enough, definitely not enough green space in Athens. We would definitely need to have more green space.
Yeah, I mean, if you think back to the earlier portion of the presentation where we had the images of the canalized river systems and other things, like, I mean, the verdant aspects of Athenian life are often kind of happy accidents. You have gardens that are cultivated deliberately by individuals, that spill over into the street. There's again this blending of the public and private, and of course there are large parks, and there are actually I think it's a function more than anything else of topography, but why they weren't developed. So you have places like Lykavitos, which is the second largest hill, or these which is the largest hill. I'm sorry, second to the Acropolis. You do have kind of topographically driven green space, so that is present, but as a kind of really deliberate and organized aspect of planning, it's present much less, as an echo of this development period. I think there have been initiatives to introduce more green space, and there are amazingly talented architects and designers pushing to expand that in Athens today. But yeah, I think it's something that, it's not the Wild West. It's still a major European capital. It's still you still have highly regulated building standards that are followed. So it's not absent of zoning. It's just you're negotiating this kind of informal legacy and using that to you have to inhabit it because it's there and it's so much of the city's fabric. Does that make sense as a kind of follow-up?
Yeah. A few more here. The Antiparochi seemed like it was a great system for socializing home ownership through the 20th century for those who owned land, at least. Is it still a system that's in use today for new development, and does it have any influence on the public conversation about access to housing and housing affordability in modern Athens? How hard or easy is it for modern Athens to maintain the social mixing essential to the polykatoikia? Sorry, I can't say that word.
Okay, polykatoikia. This is such a great question. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating system, and it is still in use today. I mean, for me, when I first arrived in Greece after my studies, abroad and I started working there as a young professional, everyone kind of took it for granted, the Antiparochi, and I kept asking, what is that? Like, you know, it was still, this was in the early 90s, it was still very much there, and it still is. But what the sad thing that's happening now, in my view, is that the scale of the city is changing. And one of the ways in which it's changing is that big corporations are buying up several apartments and turning them into Airbnbs or hotels. And so rather than have the Antiparochi, which as I tried to show, encouraged a high level of home ownership, and made it possible, really, and not just the family, but also the daughter and the son and the grandchild, intergenerational wealth in a way. That, especially after the crisis, as Praxiteles said, this is all starting to change. And it's actually a very, very worrying fact that
I think Airbnb is doing that everywhere too. It's destroying Europe.
It's destroying, it's destroying Europe. I mean, with the polykatoikia, because there were so many owners, right? And there were all the people who inherited from the family. You could never really, until recently, you couldn't really buy the entire building. It was incredibly hard. So that made it stable. But now this is changing, sadly. And so therefore the scale, this sort of intimate scale, is changing. And there was a new law that just was voted in for increasing heights of buildings, which there is a lot of opposition to that. And then one more thing I want to mention is that there is a kind of really terrible, in my view, new development called the Athens Riviera, which has terrible, it sounds terrible, especially with what's going on here in that term, how it's being used, but it's actually developed by these large corporations, and there's a huge building designed by Norman Foster, of all people, which will be the first time that the building like that will be taller, that in the Athens basin, taller than the Acropolis in like almost 3,000 years. So it's almost like a hubristic development that's happening now around the area of the old airport Ellinikon on the seaside, and all these sort of very bland, nondescript buildings topped by this enormous skyscraper that will appeal, as Praxiteles said, to foreigners primarily, not to regular Greeks, who will probably not even live there. There will be places that they, for investment. So that's not exactly this, beautiful sort of mixed city. So it is changing.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that, like, this is something that many major capitals are experiencing, this of housing inequality and access to affordable living spaces. You have to live somewhere. I think that again, one of the unique aspects that I think is true of Greece and much of Southern Europe is this connection to tourism. It's this connection to the purchasing of access to a kind of idealized, luxury image that's sold. Fundamentally, it's very, very difficult for your average, I think, working Athenian to purchase much of the new construction that's been proposed, at least, if you're considering the forces with which they have to bid against. I mean, you're always going to lose to someone that's coming in with cash, versus even there are civic programs that are designed to incentivize home buying among young Athenians or young Greeks generally. But again, you're always going to lose out to a cash offer. And that for me is where the kind of challenge lies. How do you negotiate, economic development with access to essential housing? It's a very difficult question.
And no one has it right yet. I mean, there are many efforts, especially places like Barcelona, that take this Airbnb, really seriously and try to make rules that Airbnb has to follow. And the Greek government has just introduced some rules, but it's sort of too little, too late in a way. And Airbnb has also had an effect on rents. I mean, rents have really skyrocketed, and that's been a really terrible thing for ordinary families too. So Athens is becoming the new Berlin. And there are all these Northern Europeans walking around in their shorts, which is great, but it's also pushing out the regular families.
Yeah. One comment here. Jennifer said she lived in a polykatoikia back in the 90s when she studied abroad in Athens and lived on Imitou Street, where we experienced all you described about street life, neighborhood commerce, and she appreciated the scale of the neighborhood, and even if the architecture seemed so uninspired on the face of it. But kind of commentary about it.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the crux of it, right? Like, I mean, what makes these buildings, I think, successful as neighborhoods is that they are a framework in which all this other stuff happens. Like, in architecture over the last couple of years, you've had enormous conversations about, like, particularly around housing, that have to do with infilling with the individual and the person rather than a kind of imposed idea about what that domesticity is. A couple of years ago, you had Alejandro Aravena doing the kind of half a house idea, and for me, it's a related phenomenon. I mean, you have a system that is emergent to affect this idea of you've got to house people, and within that framework you find the capacity for expression, and I find that quite beautiful. I think and in talking with other people about this, like I was asked this question of why do we feel the need to justify the beauty of these places, and I think that comment kind of captures it, because they can be very beautiful as a result of people intervening in this framework that is here.
Right. It also has to do with how we define beauty and
Exactly.
And for the longest time, I feel that when Greeks looked at Athens, they really wanted to look at Paris or London or, I don't know, Milan. But they saw this and they were really disappointed. But we need to understand that not all cities can be like that. And I think that rapidly growing and urbanizing cities, especially in the global south, have very much, similar aesthetics often. And this is actually a better quality than most informal cities, because it's not exactly informal. It's something that I've tried to talk about. But not all cities can be planned top down and have boulevards and right. So we need to adjust what we think is beautiful too.
And just to add to that, like more like if we talk about the morphology of these apartment buildings, they and I work primarily on housing, so I think in terms of a unit layout or stacking and other things. We're talking about spaces that have sometimes two balconies, one facing out into the external street and a small one in the light well in back. This is a kind of outdoor space that's driven by the climate of the just where you are. But these are actually quite successful as living spaces. Like I'm from New York. I grew up in New York City, and balcony space like that is something that is at a significant premium. And it's considered a luxury in Greece in this kind of as an incidental consequence of this typology. It's something that's quite prevalent. And I find that quite beautiful.
Yeah, I've only been in one, but there's definitely a quality, and also I think the balconies, while there's not a lot of green space in Athens, the balconies lend themselves to private or sort of semi-private gardens because they face out onto the street a lot of the time.
Yeah. And lots of people populate them with plants or trees even, they're grown. I mean, the balconies sometimes go wild, which is wonderful. And the flat roofs. I mean, they,
Yep.
you know,
Right.
they can be very green. And there's a
Right.
lot of, now there's a lot of sort of ideas on how to green the flat roofs of polykatoikia.
Well, I think we're almost close to out of time, and you guys have shared a ton of information, and it's been fascinating, and I learned a lot, and I am in the middle of reading this book. It's available on Amazon, by the way. I'm also, this has been recorded, so I put in the chat the link to the Schindler YouTube channel, so this will be on there in the next couple of weeks. I also just I'm also just putting in there, we are going to be doing another one on May 7th, which will be about Eleanor Raymond, who was a modern female architect who practiced in New England. So we want everybody to join, and I want to thank Ioanna and Praxiteles for this really great presentation and conversation, and there's so much more we could talk about, and I hope these conversations will continue offline, and I hope you inspired some people who joined us who, I don't know, some people I can tell there's Greek names in there, but it's definitely not a completely Greek audience, so it's fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Everybody who has joined us, thank you for your time, and we, continue to support the Schindler House with these talks and whatever you can do to support us financially to continue our work to preserve the Schindler House. Ioanna?
Yeah, I just wanted to say again that the Onassis Foundation, who produced this film that's based on my book and has the same title as my book, will be going up on their YouTube channel on Friday, March the 28th.
Yeah,
we've shared the link, I think, right?
I did early on.
But it's just the Onassis Foundation YouTube channel. You can see the film, and it's a great film. The filmmakers were amazing. We worked quite closely together. They went and found people who actually lived and worked during that time, both housewives and builders, and talk to them and get them to talk about what it was like. And it's very fun, and I recommend it.
It's really great. I got the sneak preview. So thank you everybody for joining us, and we hope to see you again. Have a great night.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us. Bye.
Bye-bye.